from Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook, and today we're going to do a special request that I've had requests for, and it's going to be the Neal Avenue, or otherwise known as Lost Avenue. Now, where we're standing here today along this avenue here is probably the most pristine part of the entire Gettysburg Battlefield. This avenue looks exactly the way it did when it was built between 1886 and 1890. Now, Neal Avenue, this dirt road, originally was supposed to extend further down this way and meet up in Spangler Spring at Colgrove Avenue. However, it wasn't finished. And today we're going to take you on a tour of Neal Avenue and give you an idea of what happened here on July 3rd, 1863. And I did have some notes that I wrote and a map of what happened I wrote on the outside of a pizza box here. Now, this avenue was named for a man named Thomas Hewson Neal, who was a West Point graduate, and he's actually buried in West Point Cemetery at the West Point Military Academy. Now, Thomas Hewson Neal originally mustered in to the 23rd Pennsylvania Volunteers, which were known as Bernie's Zouaves. And in early 1862, he, along with 4 different companies of the 23rd Pennsylvania, were mustered over and transferred to the 61st Pennsylvania, along with Thomas Neal, who received his promotion at that time. Now, this lane represents the line of battle that Neal's brigade occupied on the morning of July 3rd, 1863. Now, Thomas Neal was from Sedgwick's 6th Corps, but he was under the command at Gettysburg of General Slocum of the 12th Corps, and that was because on July 2nd, there was a lot of command problems due to the fact that Sickles had compromised the southern portion of the line, and men from the 6th Corps and some men from the 12th Corps on Culp's Hill had to be shifted on the battlefield. Now, where we stand right here was just off the barb of the Culp's Hill hook. And the reason that Neal was placed here by Slocum was behind us in the distance, just over the ridge there, is the Baltimore Pike. Now, 10 roads led into the town of Gettysburg, and at the time of July 3rd, 8 of those 10 roads were occupied by Confederate forces. Only 2, the Taneytown Road and the Baltimore Pike, were still in Union hands, and they were very important supply routes for the supply wagon trains. So it was Thomas Neal to protect these roads so that the Confederate left, which was in the distance over at the Daniel Lady Farm under General Edward Allegheny Johnson, couldn't get onto this side of the flank and then take this part of the field, including the Baltimore Pike, and capture it. So Neal had a specific duty over here on Wolf's Hill to protect the extreme right of the Army, and that's what he was doing. Now, here, from his official reports, Neal wrote, "On the morning of the 3rd, Major General Slocum ordered me to take a position and take 2 of my regiments on the extreme right of the entire army and prevent the enemy from turning us. Upon taking that position, I felt the enemy strong in sharpshooters and put my whole brigade in position here and stopped them from going any further." Now, what had happened was Thomas Hewson Neal was on Powers Hill, which is behind us. He took 2 of his regiments, which was the 7th Maine and the 43rd New York Volunteers, and he moved them onto the Baltimore Pike. Then from there, they proceeded past the Peter Baker farm, up the hill that we just walked to get here, and then were put into this line right here. The 7th Maine and the 43rd New York being the next 2 monuments on the lane. He brought those men up here because he felt the strong presence of sharpshooters. Now, the strong presence of sharpshooters that he felt was from the 2nd Virginia. Now, the 2nd Virginia was the old Stonewall Brigade. And the 2nd Virginia brought their sharpshooters up into the earthworks over here on the east side of Rock Creek, and they sent out one company, Company D. And Company D sharpshooters came through that wooded area and skirmished with the 43rd New York and the 7th Maine right here where we stand. Now, the strong presence of these sharpshooters convinced Thomas Hewson Neal that he needed to bring the rest of his brigade up to this hill. So he rode back down the hill on horseback and got 2 more regiments. Those 2 regiments would be this right here, the 49th New York, and then the extreme right, which would be the 61st Pennsylvania. So he brought the 61st and the 49th New York up here to this part of the field to skirmish with those sharpshooters from the 2nd Virginia and also men from the 1st North Carolina. This has been part 1 of Wolf's Hill on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And we're back up here on Wolf's Hill, and I'm standing in front of the 43rd New York Infantry Monument. And the 43rd New York Infantry, as we talked about on part 1, along with the 7th Maine, which is the next monument down, were the first 2 regiments up here to meet Company D of the 2nd Virginia Skirmishers, who were Walker's Brigade, which was the old Stonewall Brigade. Now, I do want to say that Walker was just in command of that brigade not too long. Stonewall Jackson being killed by his own men at the Battle of Chancellorsville back in May of '63, just a couple months before the Battle of Gettysburg. A strange twist of fate, and it's left up to interpretation. Had Stonewall Jackson lived, it is very, very, very unlikely that the 2nd Virginia, or any member of the Stonewall Brigade, or Stonewall Jackson, would have been in a place like Wolf's Hill. He probably would have been more in a prominent position on July 3rd, 1863. So, you had the 7th Maine, the 43rd New York, brought up here by Neal himself. In the distance behind us, on the east or the south side of Rock Creek, you got the Company D of the 2nd Virginia acting as skirmishers coming in this direction right here where we stand today. And these regiments are skirmishing together, putting up quite a fight. Neal sees that. He goes back down the hill in that direction toward the Baltimore Pike, and he grabs the 49th New York from where we shot our first video, and the 61st Pennsylvania, which is at the top of the hill. Those 2 regiments cross on the left and the right side of the Peter Baker farm and advance up in here into the avenue. And while they're doing that, the rest of the 2nd Virginia comes up here to support the skirmishers from Company D. Now you have an all-out skirmish being held right here. Now, behind the camera here, in the distance, this ridge pretty much looks the way it did in 1863. It goes about 100 yards down the hill where it goes to the Peter Baker farm, and then of course the Baltimore Pike, and then just beyond it is Powers Hill. Back on this side, the battlefield extended about another 100 yards into this clearing here behind the monument where the wood line sits. And this was about the extent of the battle here on Wolf's Hill between these skirmishers, other than a small portion of the 1st North Carolina Volunteers. Down here on the right, the 61st Pennsylvania was the extreme right of the Union Army, and then after them, nothing, except about a half a mile today on Highland Avenue Road is the 16th Pennsylvania Calvary, which were posted a little bit further to the right. But the Union infantry ended here at Wolf's Hill, ending with the 61st Pennsylvania Volunteers. And this action was taken in the early morning, beginning the early morning of July 3rd. So these regiments that were here, by the time the afternoon came, Pickett's charge began to happen. They were actually in a safe position, probably listening and hearing what was going on and waiting for orders possibly to advance in that direction if needed be to repulse the attack. This has been part 2 of Wolf's Hill on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. This is going to be part 3 of Wolf's Hill. I'm standing here at the brigade marker, and as you can see, it reads Army Lieutenant, 6th Corps, 2nd Division, 3rd Brigade, Brigadier General Thomas H. Neal, Thomas Hewson Neal. He is buried, as I said in part 1, at West Point Military Academy Cemetery. It talks about the regiments that were in his brigade. 6 companies from the 7th Maine, the 43rd New York, which is the monument we just shot in front of, the 49th New York, the one we did the first part from, the 77th New York, the 63rd Pennsylvania. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yet, when you come up here on the avenue, you only see 4 monuments. You see the 49th, the 43rd New York, you see the 61st Pennsylvania, and the 7th Maine. There is no monument up here for the 77th New York. And again, as I stated earlier, that's because the 77th New York stayed behind on Powers Hill to support the artillery that was firing over here in the distance on Culp's Hill. This has been part 3 of Wolf's Hill on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook.